Community Pulse on Radio 786 100.4 FM. The time is now 11:32, and we are into the second hour of our segment, second half an hour of our segment on social justice matters. And we are speaking to researcher Sister Lila Halsinger, who is unpacking for us the topic of the communal Huntress. And we are still speaking about, and the discussion is still centering on that of Lady Khadija. And last week we spoke about her as the queen without a king, and now we are exploring some of the dynamics around how she came to meet and marry the best of men, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Before the break, Sister Lila was just again reminding us about the measuredness of Lady Khadija and how well balanced she was, and she was also reminding us about qualities that she certainly seemingly has explored around herself before she got married. I mean, understanding her own self-worth, understanding who she is about, what triggers her, understanding how to go into spaces of calmness. And this, of course, looking at her life, went across all the different spheres. There was nothing that was dissociated. Her life as an entrepreneur, her life as a very successful businesswoman, her life as a spiritual being, her life then as a wife.
Like very holistic. But you said something before the break that I thought was actually quite important, because you mentioned, like, and we probably will go into more depth, but I just want to remind myself and emphasize on this point, because we talked about her being secure, being secure in herself, and how before you can, instead of, you can focus on looking for a spouse, but I think it's extremely important that you spend more time and energy prioritizing your own sense of security.
Yes, absolutely.
And cultivating that within yourself. And so that's why we talked about self-partnering again. And she seemed to have a sense of that, like, especially in business, you have to have that psychological resilience. Now, to your point prior to the break, she comforted her husband when he came to her. And it's important for us to remember that we can't give somebody comfort if we're not full of comfort. We can't give somebody peace if we're not full of peace. So if you're an anxious person, you don't know how to calm down, and then you have
How do
a
you
spouse
impart that?
who needs you then to give them comfort, and you're not able to do that because you yourself cannot calm yourself down. So that's a very important point. So this is why we're talking, before we start talking about the communal huntress and all the external strategies, we're talking about the importance of the internal the internal capacity, the interpersonal skills of being able to calm the self down. So again, Allah doesn't change what we have in our hands until we change who we are in ourselves. This is a higher law of ultimate attraction. So in the Gospel of Barnabas, Isa alayhi salam, aka Jesus, gives quite a lengthy sermon about the believer and issues regarding attachment. According to this account, Maryam alayhi salam thinks her son has passed, he's died, and she's grieving, but she in a sense has suffered what seems to be like an unnecessary trauma, as he was fine and he wasn't dead. So why would God put someone through that, especially such a woman of high rank and honor? Yaqub alayhi salam cried until it affected his eyes for his son, but wasn't given any assurance that Yusuf alayhi salam was okay that whole time despite being a prophet. So Isa alayhi salam explained in this gospel how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purifies the nafs through grief. Allah knows best the validity of the gospel, but we definitely have the Quran which says, do you think you'll enter paradise without being tested? And we know that the test isn't just about revealing the self, but training and enhancing certain aspects of the self. Grief and fear are two conditions that train the self, that condition the self. So it's like a type of curse or punishment to experience these perceptions that cause pain if you're attached, although that sounds too harsh because it's not coming from anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's coming from the love that guides. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests those he loves. So it's more of a discipline. It's a disciplining. Even agnostic people have observed and experienced this phenomenon of, quote, if you get attached to someone, then that personal thing will elude you if you're meant to grow spiritually.
Yes.
So it's a universal urf observation. We go, Quran, and then valid hadith, and so on and so forth, in the majority opinion, and then finally we get to ilm and urf. Urf is observation. So this is something that people, throughout all walks of life have observed, this phenomenon of attachment versus detachment. This is typically observed in relationships between men and women. And then as soon as you have moved on, or how many of us have experienced this, the exes come knocking. Many various relationship coaches have said, and there's even statistics to back this up, to the point where relationship coaches say, quote, that it's almost as if the exes are psychic and they somehow know you've leveled up, moved on, and now they want to come back. Now remember always, that the ex or the other person is just another creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the heart of any man or woman is between the two fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not even up to the other person whether they like you or not.
Yes, of course.
It doesn't make sense to take other people's attraction to you or lack thereof personally, because it's not even up to you. It's not about you as well. In the case of Khadija alayhi salam, widowed, not divorced, she wasn't rejected, but she did have to exercise detachment when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to the cave. Also, she may have had to go through a grieving phase if she was widowed and with the loss of her father, but she was able to detach later because she was complete in herself.
Yeah.
And that's actually what you're being conditioned towards, is to be complete in yourself. So she was supportive of his meditation, and we all will expound further, inshallah, when we look at her as a married woman. But good wives must be good women first, and that's what we need to work on while we again network. So the problem is that there's a lack of facilitating single people and matchmaking in the community, even though it's a sunnah. And this is where the communal Huntress theme comes into the discussion. Why the communal Huntress theme and not why the communal Huntress and not the Huntress? In many parts of the world and throughout the ages, men would venture out to hunt, but you'll notice that many times the men would hunt separately to gain ground. So one man would go east, another man would go west. It just made logistic sense for them to split up. But it was more appropriate for the men to venture out alone, while the women were encouraged to stay closer to home for obvious security reasons. Women also had to look after the children, tend to the home, and we find in many societies women were involved in local farming while the men hunted. But that doesn't mean that the women never hunted. In many societies, women were involved in what is known as communal hunting, and that means that as a group, some women would set up nests and trap prey closer to the village. It seems that men and women still run off similar cellular memory to their ancestors. Men like to hunt, but they don't like to be hunted, and they tend to take a similar approach in both business and relationships. So people, especially men, they don't like to feel that they're being sold to or targeted in marketing. So women seem to do better when working in a group or team. If a woman goes to a man more directly, then it tends to backfire. But if other people get involved, then there's a collaboration that tends to work better. Many scholars say that Khadija alayhi salam proposed, but there was a friend who facilitated between the two. Then his uncle got involved, then her cousin got involved, and so on and so forth. So there was a bit of a collaboration between the two sides. And this was after her staff worked with him and gave her feedback. She also knew of him for quite some time. She didn't just walk up to a man and proposed out of the blue. There was some groundwork and assessment that took place. So again, it needs to be understood in context. Because while fathers are important in the nikah negotiations, what about all the women who don't have their fathers to look out on their behalf? What about reverts? Because whether Khadija alayhi salam was in her late 20s or 40s, either way, she was a more mature woman, and her father wasn't present, as she had already absorbed much of his wealth and was quite independent in many ways. So, however, wealth can also make you more vulnerable in some respects. So I was watching this week a lecture by Nouman Ali Khan regarding the Surah Yusuf, verse 54 to 56, where he mentions that the king, after receiving proof that Yusuf alayhi salam was innocent, he didn't just receive proof, but he's just actually through the investigation found that this was an incredibly honest person. And then he wanted to promote him and employ him to be in this top ranking position very close to the king himself. Because, as the king, he had everything, but one thing he didn't have is trustworthy staff. You've got the cupbearer taking chances, you've got like his own advisors,
and
not being respectful.
Everyone's
got their agenda, and he finally finds one person that's actually extremely loyal and honest, and he wants this man like very close to him. And there's other variables to consider. So Nouman Ali Khan mentions in the lecture that qualifications and skills, these are things that you can train, you can learn these things, but loyalty and integrity, you either have them or you don't. And it's so funny because the very same day I was watching a content by Dan Locke where somebody asked him, what do you look for in a business partner? And without even thinking or blinking, he just said integrity and trustworthiness. And again, he said, people can learn skills. People can develop techniques.
Of course.
But you either have integrity or loyalty or you don't. And he says he wants somebody that's on the same page. He doesn't want to convert someone to have the same values as him. So what about marriage? Because we remember the last week I was reading that letter, that sort of open letter from the Facebook post about how Muslim women are not looking for boys to raise, they're looking for men. It's a similar theme of looking for somebody who's already you know, like
He's grown up.
he's grown up. Look, he might not. In the case of Musa alayhi salam, he didn't have skills. He didn't have the survival skills. So his father-in-law to be negotiated with him. He said, "Look, I can see you're a man of character, but you're going to need some training. You're going to need some mentorship for a period of time before you can be independent." And so that's why there was that negotiation. So unfortunately today, you know, that seems to be missing. There's a lack of facilitation of single people in the Ummah. There's a lack of, even though it's a sunnah, but there's also a lack of that father-in-law and son relationship as well. So, you know, Khadija alayhi salam was, in a sense, almost like a revert. Not only that, but we're looking at a woman pre-Islam having to rely on her wits, her street smarts, her sharp ability to read people well. And it's not surprising that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant someone the foresight to navigate a world of Jahiliyyah into a world of Islam. So whereas a female raised in a Muslim family would ideally be sheltered in her upbringing, and as a result will need a lot of help in navigating a landscape of suitors and so forth. Whereas the women who lack the leverage of Muslim families, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compensates them in other ways. So if you're that type of female, then you really need to pay attention to Khadija alayhi salam. And then really, you know, focus on your khadaya that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you. Because the same wisdom that helped you find your deen is the same wisdom that can help you find your spouse. And if things don't work out, then that's part of the journey as well. You know, and Allah knows best. Sometimes relationships are not meant to work out. It's not necessarily a fail. If it's finished, then it's finished. It is what it is, and Allah knows best. So I come from the point of view of what could have happened did happen. So if a woman
But I do
comes,
think it's also, sorry, Sister Lila, I think it's also important to note or to sort of preface what you just said about it not working or whatever. But it is important for ourselves also to do the work
yeah,
and then to also understand those things about ourselves.
yeah, I think if you exhaust all the possibilities and you know you've done your best, then you can have that closure. And then so beyond that, if you can stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you can say, look, I've done everything that I could, and I really did try, then that's a whole other thing, you know. And if it still didn't work out, then it's still at least you have closure. And if there's any trauma from that, sometimes a woman can come from a bad family or situation and she can be badly suited, or sometimes people make mistakes, but then the lessons and the inspiration of Asya alayhi salam comes into play here, in those type of situations. So last week or the week before, we discussed, I'm just wondering if this is relevant now, because I want to focus more on her friend Nafisa, in case we run out of time.
This is the friend that introduced.
Yes. So we learned, yes, I really want to focus on her friend.
Yes,
Nafisa.
but I do think it was important that we pause there, that we paused for a few seconds there and understand how many things within herself Lady Khadija recognized, but also in terms of externally, that she recognized and she picked up on those.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that got, we mentioned this last year, but like many people, we actually kind of skimmed through. No problem. I'm sorry. So we learned from the importance of Khadija. As you said, we learned the importance of growing ourselves and knowing our worth, but it's also important to surround ourselves with people of quality who can also introduce us to other people of quality. Khadija alayhi salam had a friend whose name is so amazingly poetic given what we discussed last week. The name of the woman is Nafisa. According to some scholars, Khadija alayhi salam was gushing in front of her, and her friend picked up that she was interested and either offered to be an intermediary or was asked. But so this is a conversation between two women, so both could have happened at the same time, as it does happen between women. We've already done it on air more than once. So whether Khadija alayhi salam asked her to be an intermediary, or whether she offered, or whether both had the same idea at the same time, Allahu alam. But it's not surprising and interesting that someone like Khadija alayhi salam would have such a good friend who would complement her in terms of values and be on the same page. So she doesn't say like, oh, but he's poor. Like she gets where her friend is and supports her decision. So in light of what Nouman Ali Khan said regarding Yusuf alayhi salam and the king, what Dan Locke said about looking for a business partner, and what the sister said about looking for a marital partner, we take for granted that this is something that we should look for in friendships as well. We need to look for this in other women. Somebody said, there was a speaker who said that the breakdown in marriages actually has a lot to do with the breakdown in relationships between women. They found that there's a correlation between the two. Women are not giving each other enough support. So what happens is we tend to burden the men emotionally and psychologically. But when we have good relationships and friendships with women, that also helps to facilitate our wholeness as well, you see. So, just
And that's such an interesting point. And I'm thinking back to a discussion that we had with our resident research, our relationship counselor that usually comes in, who spoke to us about that. I think it was 2 Mondays ago. The idea that one thinks that you should find this one person
yes.
that's going to meet sort of
Yeah.
all your needs. So firstly, again, to go back on what on
Yeah.
the discussion with Lady Khadija, that she also understood those things about herself, what she can give
Yes.
and what she can't give, and she surrounded herself with people
Yes.
who not necessarily to complete her, to fill the gaps in her, but like-minded
Yeah.
people.
See,
Because
now
you can't
she-
look for happiness in somebody
Yeah,
else.
we're learning from her, besides the professional strategies because a good business person has a good team. You're not going to be a successful entrepreneur unless you have a good team. And you need to, in order to have a good team, you got to be able to read people and then cultivate good relationships. But now we're also learning from her that the same is true for personal relationships, for your
yes.
personal life. That's another thing that you have to take care of. Not just your business, not just your professional, but who are you hanging out with, who are you friends with? Because they are a huge support structure. So, for example, in today's day and age, just revealing that you like someone who has earned your interest can backfire in some situations. Not everyone is as supportive as Nafisa, because this friend is mentioned very briefly, but scholars don't take time to look at her friend and connect the dots as to why someone like Nafisa is her friend in the first place, and look at how she responds to Khadija alayhi salam's positive reaction to the love interest. She doesn't even have to explain, because she just gets it. She's on the same page.
So there's clearly an established relationship. There's clearly sort of a resonance between the two of them.
So what I've been doing since 2020 is taking reports from various scholars and content and finding the common ground to string the story together until a fuller picture emerges. And I find that when it comes to this part where Nafisa assists, the scholars and commentators, they tend to skim over this section and hurry hurry to the climax of the story. But it's actually very important to pause here and learn from this, because I often find that there is this rough sentiment of, hey, sisters, you can just propose to a man because, Lady Khadija alayhi salam did it, and she's the best of women. Okay, yes, but there's more to it than that.
Of course.
Lady Khadija alayhi salam was a successful businesswoman. And as I just mentioned, that same genius regarding cultivating a team, we now see that in her personal relationships. And now we're learning that she was just as smart when it came to her personal life, and so should we be. Before we even consider any man, we first need to look at the people and the friends we have in our lives, because if we have friends who backbite and are full of hasad, not only are they not equipped to identify a good man, but they might interfere with your relationship or marriage once you found someone, and they will try and show you up as inferior. And I think it's important to consider if we Muslim women are anything like Nafisa, or are we her opposite. It's important that we ask, am I someone that Khadija alayhi salam would want to hang out with?
Yeah.
Are we who Khadija alayhi salam would want to be friends with? If we backbite, slander, try to show other women as inferior, or mess with other people's relationships, or dishonor them, then the answer is no. And if you are someone who doesn't deal with your hasad appropriately and let your nafs run the show, then you're never going to have a friend like Khadija alayhi salam. So, relationship gurus are always telling women that they can't expect to attract high quality men if they aren't high quality women, but the same is true for friendships. If you want a friend who's more like Khadija alayhi salam, then you should be more like Nafisa. And if you want a friend like Nafisa, then you must be more like Khadija alayhi salam. Either way, you must be a quality person if you want to have another quality person. If you're the opposite of these women, then you will repel high quality men and women. Only the low quality people will tolerate you, and they will mistreat you like you mistreat everyone else. So there's a karmic, akhira, energetic consequence, but there's also a situational consequence to in terms of your character regarding both business and your personal life. If you behave in such a way, but then also surround yourself with people that behave in such a way, because it can also rub off on you, and it can also bring you down in terms of your spiritual growth as well.
Yes, of course. That's why the idea of like-minded people, resonance, and the idea around not seeking answers or seeking somebody to complete you, whether it's a friend. And when I say complete, I mean in the sense that sort of make up for the gaps that you have.
Yes.
So if you're not spiritually self-sufficient, as we spoke about earlier on, you can't look to somebody else to fill that gap.
Yeah.
You need to do the work as well.
Yeah. It's a two-way thing. So you have to be that person.
Absolutely.
You have to like rise up to be that type of person, and then make sure that you're surrounded with those types of people. And then, I mean, again, our community doesn't facilitate single people like the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Isa Baha used to do. And it's been said that if you're divorced or widowed today with kids, like your biggest problem back then is trying to choose between the many proposals you would have received. Whereas today that's not the case. But we can learn. But you know, Khadija alayhi salam did not necessarily have that facilitation either, because this is in pre-Islamic period of Jahiliyyah. But we can learn from her that there are other strategies, there are other ways to network. And the thing is that, look, even if hypothetically speaking you don't find someone, you can have a life so long.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
you can have a great life, and you can say Alhamdulillah, Subhanallah, and you can live your life, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you life to live to the fullest. So go ahead and live to the fullest, Alhamdulillah. You understand? Instead of like moping about not having somebody or being
Which is clearly not what Lady Khadija did exactly. So the
Yeah.
idea of completing half your religion doesn't mean that I can then lack in that half and expect somebody else
because
to
you
make up.
still
I
you
think
still want to
that's
you because that's the thing, you're still gonna have to grow.
yes, of
It's all
course.
about growth, and that's how you know you're a quality person, is if you're constantly growing, and that's how you know if other people are quality people, if they're constantly growing and they're constantly requiring more of themselves. Yeah.
So perhaps your closing remarks on this topic, the idea of the communal huntress, in the last 2 or 3 minutes that we have.
Okay, so today, a woman without the patriarchal leverage, and whether she is a virgin or previously married or has children from the previous marriage, should definitely look at her social area, especially in terms of quality people, not quantity people. And of course, she should consider her own company while releasing the triggers from trauma, as discussed in the orbit of Miriam. And besides that, there's a lot we can do as a community to facilitate single people. But what I do strongly recommend is that, as we discussed in the orbit of Miriam, that wisdom being incorporated of healing and releasing
Yes.
triggers, and then the matchmaking, that external collaboration can come later, but it's there's a lot you can actually do in the meantime.
And I think that was so important that you mentioned the fact that if we struggle to emulate these women in and of themselves, given the fact that they are placed on such high stations and given the fact that they set such a high bar, set the bar so high,
Yeah.
try to emulate their friends. Be the sort of person that they would want to be with.
That's what brothers do. They say, well, if I can't be like the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, I'll try and be like the
Yeah,
Sahaba.
just
I'll
be
try and be like the Sahaba.
yeah, just
Yeah.
try to think of yourself as the sort of person that one of them would like to
Yeah.
spend time with. As usual, Sister Lila, shukran so much. I mean, a lot of context, but also a lot of real life sort of lessons in the that we can take with us. So until next week for another sort of provocative topic. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran for having me.
And so that concludes today's segment on social justice matters. And we've been speaking to Sister Lilla Heldzinger, who spoke to us about the communal huntress. We are still centering our discussion around the life of Sayyidina Khadija alayhi salam.